Hey everybody, you got your old pal Jack Photon here. You know, there was this once when, a while back, the very fabric of space-time ripped all around me, and I was thrown into another universe. Now, when you find yourself floating for all eternity with infinity all around you, it gives you some time to think. So I said to myself, Jack, you know you enjoy a nice game of chess, and those role-playing games too. So why don't you take them dice and those chess pieces and give them a good shake? So here you go, folks. Jack Photon's Interphasic Space Chess game. Now I'm going to go ahead and reckon you know how to play yourself some chess. If you don't, you kind of have to know how to play yourself some chess. So I'll wait here while you pause the video playback and go learn. Great, you're back, and pretty good at sallying yourself across the board, I hear. Good. So let's read the Interphasic Space Chess rules. You're going to need yourself one complete chess set. That's 32 pieces on a board. You're going to need a pair of 10-sided dice. Ideally per player, but as long as you have one pair, you can share them. Now those dice, they're going to be read sequentially, generating values from 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 98, 99, and 100. So when you see 2 zeros on the dice, that's 100. It's not 0. So what you do is, one die is declared as first, and then both are rolled. If they're different colors, you can say green or red or whatever. If they're the same color, then roll one first, and then roll another one second. So that first roll is going to be your tens column, and the second roll is going to be your singles column. So depending on what die you called, a roll of 0 and a 1 is either going to be read as a 1 or a 10, depending. Play begins with each king alone on the board in their home positions. New pieces are rolled into play, materializing on their home square. Each player has one of two options per turn. A, you can roll the dice to bring a new piece into play, or B, you can move a piece that's already in play. If a rolled piece is already in play, you lose your turn except for the queen. Just like normal chess rules, you can have any amount of queens on the board at the same time, but new queens may only enter play while their home square is open. We'll talk about that in a minute. Otherwise, you can never have more than the standard number of pieces on the board at once, and they always start in their home square. If the home square of a rolled piece is occupied, that piece does not enter play and the turn is lost, except for the rooks, bishops, and knights, which we'll talk about in a moment. Captured pieces are removed from the board, and they could immediately be rolled back into play on the very next turn. So if you're notating your game, simply write the dice result and the home square as your move. So you roll a 58, and you decide to put a pawn on the queen's knight square of b2. Or you roll an 89 and you want to put a king's pawn on d7. 32, that's going to be a bishop, whether it's your king or queen's bishop, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first we're going to talk about pawns. Now it's the player's choice which pawn enters play, but you can never double them up except for when a pawn does its standard diagonal attack move. So as it's the dice that bring new pieces into play, when a pawn gets to the far side of the board, they simply double back to their side's home row, always attacking forward. So from then, a pawn is going to bounce between rows 1 and 8 forever until they're captured or blocked. They may start in rows 2 and 7, but they don't stop there. They always go to rows 1 and 8 and back and forth. Now, a pawn that's heading back to its home is called a retreating pawn. And that pawn can attack any other major piece except for another pawn from the rear. And your retreating pawn can become blocked by your opponent's pawn if that opponent never moves that pawn again. Meanwhile, an opponent's pawns are free to attack a retreating pawn from the rear, normally or en passant. Now the rook, bishop, and knight. So you players are going to agree to odd or even for the king or queen side, and then you're going to roll one die. So if you say king is odd and you roll a 7, then you got the king's bishop, the king's rook, or the king's knight. If you roll a 6 or a 4 or a 2, then you got the queen's rook or the bishop or the knight, except if one is already in play. If you already have your king's bishop in play and you roll another bishop, you automatically get the queen's bishop. There is no circumstance where you can have 2 king's bishops or 2 queen's bishops. Now, castling is by standard chess rules as long as the space is clear and neither the king nor the rook has moved, on the occasion of that rook being rolled into play. So if or when your king ever moves, castling is forbidden for the duration of the game. However, it could be your 5th rook rolled onto that very same square, but as long as it hasn't moved since being rolled into play, you can still castle. That rook could have moved all over the place on the 1st through 4th times that it came into play, but as long as that time that it comes into play and the castling has happened and neither the king or that rook have moved and the space is clear, it's all legit. When a king can no longer block or move and still faces checkmate, only then, if a die roll can bring a blocking piece into play whose home square is directly in line with the mating piece, and it does so, mate is deferred. Now there's an optional rule for this here, called the king's summons. Normally, if a home square is blocked, a newly rolled piece cannot interplay. We already covered that. Now in the case of a checkmate, if the mating piece is on the king's back row and happens to occupy the newly rolled piece's home square, the king summons, displaces, and captures the mating piece with the newly rolled piece, deferring mate. Now this displacement does not apply to the pawn's row, but it does allow by king's decree which of the paired pieces is going to appear, whether it's a rook, knight, or bishop, unless that bishop is already on the board. So if to block a checkmate you need your king's bishop, and that king's bishop is already on another square somewhere else and can't move into position, you get the queen's bishop and you're still in checkmate. Game over. Now for the dice chart. Here's how I figured it out. Now it's the normal point value for all the pieces, and I simply doubled that number to give me the odds. So you got 8 pawns out of 16 pieces, which means there's a 1 in 2 chance that you're going to roll a pawn. So that's 51 to 100 on the dice. So by doing that, the bishops and knights at 3 points each become 1 in 6, or 16.666, repeating 6%. At the rook at 5 points becomes 1 in 10, and the queen at 9 becomes 1 in 18, but I had to fudge those percentages. So with the bishop and the knight each being at 16 point, repeating 6%, those need to go up to 17% each. So that 0.8% between them comes out of the queen 7% and makes her a dice roll of 1 through 6. The rook 7 through 16, bishop 17 through 33, knight 34 through 50, and then a pawn is 51 through 100. Now remember, once you got 8 pawns on the board, half of all your dice rolls are going to be lost turns. And that's pretty much it. All the other standard rules of chess apply as you, the players, agree to.